We are now on the record. Thank you for the prompt, Mr. Weddleton. This is the Assembly Committee on Housing and Homelessness meeting on Wednesday, April 20th, 2022 at 11 a.m. at the Assembly Chambers of the Lusac Library. I call this meeting to order. Will the clerk please take the roll?
Ms. Howard?
She's excused.
Mr. Thompson?
Here.
Mr. Dunbar? Ms. Kennedy? Ms. LaFrance?
Here.
Mr. Perez-Revilla? Mr. Peterson?
Present.
Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Here.
Mr. Rivera?
Present.
Mr. Weddleton?
Here.
Thank you. Looks like we have 3 out of 6 members here. I don't know that that establishes a quorum, right? Of the members of the committee, it's actual committee. So we have more members of the body here, unless the header is wrong on the master here, the masthead. So that's okay, though. We don't really have any official business to conduct other than hearing from the public and getting reports. And so we can always receive reports as part of the record. And the first part of the agenda is initial audience participation. So members of the public will have up to 3 minutes to speak. If you'd like to come on up, now would be the time. There will be final audience participation at the end should we have time. I'm seeing nobody stand up to come to the microphone, so we will close initial audience participation. And the first item of, well, I should also ask, is there anyone else on the phone? Is there anyone else on the phone? We have Mr. Rivera identified.
Ms. Maureen Aqua.
Can you say that one more time?
Sure. My name is Maureen Aqua, and I'm on the phone as well.
Thank you. And are you with an organization?
I'm with the Anchorage Health Department, and the Aging and Disability Resource Center. Just listening in today and interested in the coalition's report.
Thank you. Travis, can we figure out how to turn that volume down slightly? I think it's getting clipped out and unable to understand what's being said. Okay. With that, the order of today, the agenda is going to be to take up a conversation from the Coalition on Homelessness, a monthly update, discussion about the Sockeye Inn, complex care, proposed navigation center discussion, and a briefing on the facilitated process. Kind of fits into 2 places on the agenda. An update on the facilitated process is part 4 and 5 part 1. So we'll kind of streamline that. And then a discussion about committee goals and priorities in the budget. And then final audience participation. Does any member wish to add any item to that? I'm hearing and seeing none. So we will proceed then to take up the question of the Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness. I don't see anyone here from Rasmussen. Is anyone here from Catholic Social Services? Okay, we do have someone here from Catholic Social Services. And is someone here from the coalition? So, Travis.
This is Taria Ware with the Coalition in Homelessness.
Is this, okay, Taria? If you'd like, the floor is yours to make a report.
I believe our attorney is going to go first, and I'll jump to the conflict.
So would you say
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was hoping we could take up the issue of the complex care shelter in Sockeye Inn as I have a conflict and have to exit the meeting before noon.
Sure. If there's no objection, we'll go ahead and take up the question of the complex care facility. You have the floor.
Thank you. So it's my pleasure to be here with you today to talk about the Sockeye Inn and the complex care shelter. My name is Meg Balaton, Interim Executive Director of the Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness, and we've had the pleasure to work on project as the Continuum of Care. And just briefly, the Continuum of Care for Anchorage is the entity responsible for the geographic design of the homeless prevention response system. So that's everything from prevention to housing. And we work collaboratively with philanthropy, government, and community partners to make sure we have a full spectrum of services to meet individuals' needs. And so, as the mass care exit strategy identified the need for a complex care shelter or to help people who were experiencing medical challenges, simultaneously, that need had already been identified through the award of a pilot program to the coalition to explore the intersection of healthcare and homelessness. And so it was really a great opportunity to marry those two ideas together. And so we had the opportunity to do a lot of work to bring forward the program for the second. So let's just start with complex care and what it means. A complex care shelter offers an option for clients who are not well served in a general population congregate facility, and then provides a stable location to address their unmet needs, and typically create a barrier to housing. And the spaces allow people to access a place to rest and recover 24/7, and connect them to essential medical and social services, and create a plan to secure permanent, successful housing. So the partnership to move the sockeye forward included Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness to convene a group of experts that included Agnes Beck, Catholic Social Services as the provider, who was really piloting this idea, and Brothers Franklin Shelter during, as mass care was stood up, they were taking individuals who weren't well suited to mass care, and then Rasmussen Foundation, there to provide expertise, and the Mental Health Trust Authority to talk through the differences between complex care and assisted living. And so what ensued were hundreds of hours of both group work and individual work to create what will now become the Sockeye Inn. And then once the program was established and the funding identified, we were able to work with Ship Creek Community Assets too, as the building's owner, to have them bring in, and we're slated to open in partnership in supporting Catholic Social Services around June 1st. The coalition will continue to support this effort as we move through case conferencing and referrals to ensure that we're meeting the needs and getting the right individuals into that facility, and then on the path to a housing situation. I'm not sure if there's someone from Catholic Social Services there who would like to add any additional information about the Sockeye Inn, and I believe there may be someone on the line from Rasmussen who might have additional information they would like to provide.
Thank you, and I would note that about 5 minutes ago, I was notified that Mr. President and Mr. Number joined us on the phone. So we do have a representative from Catholic Social Services. You want to come up and identify yourself for the record, and then let us know what's happening. There's a yellow button. You're on.
Great, thank you. Hi, my name is Robin Dempsey. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Catholic Social Services. I think everything Meg said really described very well what we're doing. We're really excited about this project, and we're excited about it for so many reasons. I mean, certainly because it is a real testament, I think, to what can happen when there's a public-private partnership. But we've also really recognized the need to serve this particular population. And as Meg was saying, we've been piloting this at Brother Francis Shelter, and I would say that it's been very successful. Some of the things maybe I could maybe highlight a little bit is that, besides just being a shelter and a safe place for people to be, there really will be an emphasis on very specific case management in this particular facility. And I think that really is the piece that we need to make sure that people are connected to the correct resources and benefits that they need, so that we can really help them find stability and permanency in the housing arena. So that is our goal, and I'm happy to questions, but we're very excited about the project.
Thank you. Briefly, would you restate, did you say you were the executive director of Catholic Social Services?
Yeah, CEO of Catholic Social Services.
So are you the permanent
Yes,
or acting?
permanent, yeah.
Well, welcome aboard. So
Thank you.
I think it would be a good thing at some point to do a separate briefing on welcome and conversation about the future of Catholic Social Services with the committee or with another body of the assembly, because there's been a long history with the organization and we'll make sure it's off on the great foot.
Yeah.
Mr. Welton?
Thanks. So you've been doing this at Brother Francis for many months now, over a year, I think
Yes.
now. So maybe tell us a little bit about how many people, and then they'll move to the sockeye, freeze up space, and then what are your plans for Brother Francis at that point?
Sure.
And then are you just moving current staff over to sockeye? Just kind of help us with those logistics.
Yeah, absolutely. So right now, there are approximately 62 people that stay at the Brother Francis shelter outside of our medical respite program. So these are the folks that we've identified as, needing space that really is a little bit more specific. That really kind of, I think, goes to meet the needs of the people that are medically fragile. That not all of those 62 people are medically fragile. We do actually have a program inside of our shelter called the in-house program, which is a necessary program to help us just with sort of maintaining the shelter itself. So there are guests that stay there, but then also help us kind of run the facility. So I don't have the exact number, but if I had to guess, there's probably about 50 people that would kind of come into that medically fragile definition. So those are folks that we would be looking to move over to the sockeye, the complex care shelter. And so that shelter is really slated to be able to accommodate 83 people. So there will also be an opportunity for us to be identifying folks that are at the Sullivan Arena to come into this space as well. In terms of staffing, we are starting to hire. We've identified a director for this particular facility, and there is a need to staff up. So there will be about, let's see, there are somewhere around 32 frontline staff that will be at the sockeye, and that will be completely separate from what we have at the Brother Francis shelter right now.
Thank you.
Mr. Rivera, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and apologies for the numbers grabbing a little bit in person. I'm actually at the airport right now, it's like street board in a second. But I have a few things. First, and I'm just going to put it all out there, a little bit of a word on it. So first is, if there's anyone that's there from the residents, and it would be interesting to hear from the residents, and particularly as they were key partners in helping with the development of this project. And, I think I can't understate enough how many hours went into this project, as is also stated, 180 hours, and how complex it truly was to get this done. A pun intended. So then a few additional questions. The first is, and these ones are specific for Catholic Social Services. First is, what's the expected length of stay for individuals? Second is, has CSS talks with neighboring community councils or with the members? And then third is, funding for this facility stable, or will you be, do you ever imagine coming to the assembly request regular funding for this facility? Thank you.
Mr. Rivera, could you restate questions 2 and 3? It came across quite muffled.
Sure. So the second question is, has CSS talked with the community council or with neighbors about if there are issues, how you plan on working with the neighbors and the community council on those issues? And then the third question is around funding sustainability. Is the funding for this facility sustainable, or do you imagine yourself coming to the municipality requesting funding in the future? Thanks.
So I'm going to try to restate your questions to make sure that we heard you properly. The first one is, can you discuss the anticipated length of stay of clients in the facility? Number two is, does CSS have plans for outreach to neighbors surrounding the facility? And then the third one is kind of a discussion about the funding at this time, and do you have plans to come for more funding? Is that a fair assessment of your questions, Mr. Ray?
Yes, it is, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you.
First one again, I'm sorry.
Length of stay.
Length of stay. That's a great question. And our hope is always to help people stay in shelter for the shortest amount of time possible. We've talked about, a 30-day stay. I think with the folks that we'll be serving, my anticipation is that it will be longer. But I think that probably the most important point I can make about this is that there will be immediate connection to case management. And that really is the service that they're going to need to really help identify what resources they are going to need in order to leave shelter and get permanently housed. So that will be a huge emphasis on case management. Second question.
The second question was, what has or is planned by CSS to engage with the neighbors, community councils, et cetera, around the facility?
Yes, no, I appreciate that, thank you. So yes, that is something that we are in discussion about right now. So as soon as those plans, I think, are put together, we'll be happy to share this with you. But our communication team and our partners are in conversation about that to make sure that happens. We definitely want to connect with the community and the folks that are really in that vicinity. So that will be a high priority for us.
Thank you. And the third one was kind of a discussion about the funding and establishing your thoughts on needs for the interim future. Do you need to come back to the meeting? What should we be thinking about?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that the funding that we've gotten for this year is a 7-month amount, which is wonderful. It's kind of what we need for the rest of this year. I do anticipate that year to year we will need to come back for those dollars. I would say also that that's also kind of more conversation that we're having with the coalition and with our other partners to identify funding sources. But without a doubt, there'll be a need to come back to the municipality and the assembly for funding in the future. I think we're really looking at this right now as kind of a 3-year pilot project that we are feeling pretty good about the funding for. There'll be an opportunity to really demonstrate need, but I would say as we have an aging population in this particular group, we foresee that the need for this type of a shelter will continue well into the future.
Thank you. I have the coalition in the queue.
I just wanted to add briefly on the length of stay issue and highlight that Catholic Social Services, ADRC, the coalition, and other providers already have stood up and have been working basically at complex care case conferencing, which I believe happens weekly or at least monthly. And what they're doing is they're really identifying individuals who need referrals to ADRC for purposes of applications for Medicaid, exploring possible assisted living home placements, and really looking holistically at these complex care individuals to get their needs met. And they're having great success, as we just know that engaging with Medicaid and some of these other services, whether it's Social Security, Medicaid, or finding an appropriate placement in an assisted living home, just takes longer. But the mechanism to do that work is already stood up and has some proven success. Thanks.
Right, I have a question. So what is the plan then for Brother Francis Shelter?
So the plan for Brother Francis Shelter is to go back to a low-barrier shelter. So that is where we're headed. I mean, that is the space that we have held in that shelter for decades, and that is our anticipation that we'll go back to low-barrier.
Capacity?
So as far as capacity is concerned, I think the conversations that we've had, and certainly what we've been told by the facilitated process, is that they have identified that we need to be able to shelter for 75 people. So that's where the conversations have been, and if there's a need for us to have further conversation about that, we're happy to do that.
Yeah, thanks. I know that neighbors heard the 75 number at several meetings I was at and weren't concerned with that number, but were concerned if that number goes up in any meaningful way. So, Mr. Dunbar, with you.
Thank you. And I was going to ask that question about capacity. The prior Brother Francis at one time was 240 capacity. Now you're dropping it all the way down to 75. Can you explain why? Why 75? Why not 200?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'd say there's a couple of reasons for that. I think initially, given the folks that we've been serving, we have changed the way, kind of the layout in our shelter. So certainly with folks that had medical concerns, we had a bunk bed situation that we've now disassembled so that we can make sure that people have had the accessibility that they needed. In terms of the future, honestly, 200 people is just a massive amount of people to have on that campus at any one time. We really want to make sure that we are providing the best service possible for the people that we're serving. And I think with this facilitated process and the idea that there will be other types of shelters around town, and this idea that we're kind of moving to the smaller shelter systems, for us, we feel like that's a very trauma-informed way to go forward with this. It's a really important piece to us as an agency. Again, we really just want to make sure that we are providing the best care that we can for the people that we serve.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that smaller shelters generally are better. But it is interesting to hear what you say, 200 people is too many to have concentrated in that place, and that's right. It's worth noting that the administration is proposing a 330-bed facility. So I guess I would sort of take issue with the idea if we were going to a smaller shelters around town system, if we're actually having one that is 330, that is much larger than Brother Francis ever was. And so, if for example, that 330-bed facility went down to 150 or 200, is there a world in which, a portion of that difference could be made up by Brother Francis to go to 125, for example?
That's certainly something that we've been talking about, and I think that obviously there's other pieces that would need to be discussed in order for us to get to that number. But it is a discussion that we would be willing to have.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm just going to interject that the number 240 was never adhered to at that campus. They had multiple buildings. They had people lying on the ground like sardines in the most inhumane way, and then people camped for a quarter of a mile in any direction. So really, there were 500 or so people, plus or minus, that were inhabiting that area. And that building was never designed for more than 100 or so people, 120 max. And so it's not so simple as saying, well, they had that many people there before, so somewhere between here and there we can land. What has to be done is whatever system is developed, we have to ensure that the facilities are developed to meet the needs of the people that will be there, not just to fill as many bodies into a space as possible, because that's the old model.
I'll say that I totally agree with that. And having 240 people in one facility, but like you said, that draws a larger sort of community. You end up with 400 or 500 in the area around. Similarly, if you put 330 in an area where there already is another facility with 100 beds, just down the road, I think you can expect 500 or 600 people to be in that immediate vicinity. And to do that, I think is totally inappropriate. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for total agreement.
Point of order raised. Go ahead, Mr. Wells.
We strayed far from the sockeye issue that we're on.
Thank you. So, anyone else? Is Rasmussen on the line? I'm not hearing anyone from Rasmussen. So, at this point, probably we will roll into the next section of the agenda, which is a discussion of the proposed navigation center. There was anticipated to be a resolution. The resolution is not prepared. Therefore, that conversation is tabled from this committee at this time. Who is prepared to lead the conversation about the navigation center?
I could start off something briefly regarding the resolution. And the facilitate the process. Of course, we're continuing to look at that one component of the broader system that's being developed. And,
That's Mr. Welton, by the way.
oh, sorry. And one thing we're looking at is like how long would we need to have, another low barrier shelter in town, particularly at that location, and trying to time constrain it if possible. And that is looking at kind of once we reach as a city functional zero in homelessness, then there would be less or no need for a second low barrier shelter. And working on that resolution, we'd hope to have it for this meeting, but the definition of functional zero is somewhat elusive. And we hope to address that at the facilitated meeting today at 1 o'clock to 3 and have something ready. And certainly with a real goal of having it before the 26th when we'll be looking at funding for the shelter. But I think that's been a real concern for people. It's like, I'm certain we've got the size down to a reasonable level, and just how long would be the question would it exist next. And Larry may be able to, Mr. Baker may be able to embellish.
So I think that term reasonable is one that is going to be subject to much debate. Mr. Baker.
Mr. Chairman, I think this afternoon the facilitation group, we're going to try to finalize this resolution. We've given it to the attorneys, and that's always a challenge, as we well know, because we get 2 attorneys and get 5 opinions. So I think we're getting really, really close. We just started discussing this actually at a meeting last Wednesday, and so it's been in process since then. And I'm feeling really good about where we're going to land. And I think that's really positive. I think it's a very positive step forward coming out of the facilitation group with a recommendation, hopefully that all your colleagues can support, because it's kind of key to the navigation center concept. And so maybe if I could just speak, Mr. Chairman, on a broader scale for just a second. Perhaps I have not appeared before this committee before, but have been part of the administration's negotiating team since we started this process in August. And I just want to say to the people here and those online that an immense amount of work has gone in to get us to this point. The sockeye inn that we just spoke about is the first plank in the 4-plank plan that we successfully brought together, and through a lot of discussions thanks to philanthropy, finding the right partner to purchase the asset with a combination of government funds and philanthropy, and that's a huge success for our community. And that's just the beginning. But this process is something that this community has never ever seen before. And there's a commitment on the part of the administration, there's a commitment on the part of the assembly, there's a commitment on the part of philanthropy to work together to really address this bigger community problem that has never had focus like it's had in the last 9 or 10 months. So I'm delighted to have been part of that process, working with different colleagues on this body, because people have changed. There's been changes on the administration side of the facilitation group. Mr. Revelton and I think, are the only original members that are still standing. So we've been to wars, and it has just been for me personally, and for this community, I think that you're going to see really good results as the various elements of the plan are unveiled, and as we put the final touches on them. And I just want to say thank you to the assembly members here today and all your colleagues, because you supported us as we go forward, point after point. So, Mr. Chairman, that's a long speech for a very short question, but I just wanted to kind of get that on the record, that I'm very appreciative of all that you and your colleagues have done to help us as we maneuvered through this process.
So there's a question from Mr. Dunbar. Ms. Quinn-Davidson, you'll be next, because I didn't know you were, I would have let you go first, but go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we have a funding request for the Navigation Center for, it was 8.2 million, now it's 6.2 million on the 26th. And, you know, we've heard a lot of concerns from the neighborhood about the size of that facility. And we have, in previous ordinances, imposed limits on you know, construction and fund. We attach strings to funds. Like, for example, when we purchased the Golden Lion, we put in the ordinance that it could not be used as a homeless shelter. And so I guess my question is that funding, you know, this has been going on for many months now. We've been moving in this direction, and sort of at every time that I've tried to put a limit on the size or really any kind of protections for the neighborhood onto this project, I've been told you can't do it now, it's not the appropriate time, it's not the appropriate time. And I'm surprised about this resolution asking that the facility be time bound, that be temporary. I think that is a sort of Pollyanna resolution, frankly. I do not believe that this will be a temporary structure if we spend at least $9 million to build it. But my question is, you know, if I want to, for example, make sure that we are designing and constructing facilities 150 beds with 50 bed surge capacity, is this funding ordinance the right place to put that restriction on? Or is the opinion of the administration that this is, again, not the right time that we can even have that conversation?
Mr. Baker.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Dunbar, at any point, obviously, that amendment can be made. This is a critical point because, as you mentioned, we moved $2.8 million into the community foundation, and that money has now been appropriated, and so the remaining amount, I believe, is 6.2 or thereabouts. So it will be before the body on Tuesday, and the current design is for the 200 person capacity. For the wintertime surge, possibly up another 130. But the design is for the 200 person capacity, and to navigate people and not the shelter. We keep referring to shelter, but this is truly a navigation center to navigate people into the right housing component. So at any point, Mr. Dunbar, obviously that amendment, this would be another time if you so wish to discuss that, because we are now entering the design phase, and I believe well, I know that process has started. I'm told it's about a 21-day process. And so if there were a change Tuesday night for some reason, then the design would have to be altered accordingly if so chose.
Can I ask a follow-up, Mr. Chair?
Yeah, the floor.
Yes, thank you. Actually, a couple of follow-ups. So what I've heard reference to design in the past from the money that we appropriated, I've always heard this is very preliminary. This is very preliminary design. We don't have a very detailed, we didn't even have sort of a detailed idea of where that facility was going until just a few weeks ago, and what its footprint would be. And when I asked, how large this facility would be, I heard sort of a range of between 21,000 and 30,000 square feet, something like that. So I guess I'm heartened to hear from Mr. Baker that it takes about 21 days to redesign this from the current state of that. To shrink the facility, and that does seem appropriate because, again, we've been assured over and over that there isn't a detailed design yet. And so, I guess, my two questions for Mr. Baker are, one, you mentioned $2 million for the community foundation has from is the administration's assertion that money can't come back to this project if the size of the project is limited to 150 beds, that somehow, it must be 330? And the second is, we have an ongoing navigation center at the Sullivan Arena, and I think it's been quite successful. We still have 300 people at the Sullivan Arena. Do you believe that if we did not have another navigation center, that the navigation center operating at the Sullivan would eventually get the Sullivan population down to 0?
Well, if, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Dunbar, I think your first question was regarding the funding that was approved by this body, the $2.8 million, $2 million of it went to the, $2.8 million went to the Continuum Foundation, and those funds have now been in the process of being dispersed. The $800,000 was dispersed, and $2 million is in process of doing so. Obviously the facility, no matter what the size, would be in excess of $2 million. So those funds will be dispersed for that purpose as was approved by this body. In terms of the conversion from the Sullivan, if the resolution that the facilitation group is working on, that would apply, I believe, to any facility that we might have. To get to functional zero, which is a stated purpose, and you'll probably recall that this body has addressed that a couple of years ago as a goal of homelessness. That applies across the spectrum to the entire homeless situation, and it's not just this facility specific. Functional zero applies to homelessness in our community.
Okay, so I don't think that really answered my second question, though. And I appreciate that. And everyone's goal is functional zero. I'm very supportive of the housing projects and the complex care facilities, the things that we are standing up around those sort of smaller facilities. Although I am worried that it seems like this facility is going to be stood up before a lot of those other facilities come online, with the exception of the Sockeye Inn. But again, the administration's assertion is this is a quote-unquote navigation center, not a shelter, and so people will only be there short-term, and the population will be much smaller than 330. But we have a navigation center operating right now. The facility might not look pretty, but the actual services, getting people connected to services, to housing, that's exactly what we're doing at the Sullivan Arena. And then we have, it appears, a sort of sustained population at the Sullivan Arena. And so my question is, in what ways will, if we did not construct this navigation center and we kept using the navigation services at the Sullivan Arena, is it your opinion that would get down to zero, or there would only be very short stays at the Sullivan Arena? And I'm not advocating that we do that long term. I'm just sort of curious, why would the services being offered at the navigation center be more effective than what we are currently doing down at the Sullivan Arena?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Bender, that's really something I don't think I can direct. So I'm not close enough to the issue to be able to tell you about specific programs or transition or the programs that are being currently run at the Sullivan Arena. As we all know, that June 30th, we need to be exiting the Sullivan Arena in order to accommodate another part of our community that needs that facility repurposed. And we've been talking about that for several months, and we're doing everything possible to achieve those goals of repurposing that building. So I probably didn't answer your question in full detail, and I apologize for that, but some of the details of the programming specific and what's being conducted, that's just not something I'm very conversant about, so I apologize for that.
So I would just add, Mr. Dunbar, that one of the previous conversations we had at length is the fact that it costs so extraordinarily much to operate anything at the Sullivan Arena. I think that that was one of the fundamental principles. It's not a simple argument about operations. So I have several people in the queue. Ms. Quindeva, Ms. LaFrance, Mr. Bresordia, and then Mr. Weldon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a lot of similar comments and questions to Mr. Dunbar. And I guess given that we're having a work session on Friday, I just wanted to throw some of them out so that, Mr. Baker, if you're not the one to answer questions, that the person who can answer the questions is there. I mean, we're being asked, in a matter of 6 days to approve a $10 million plus facility that I know very little about. And the public knows very little about. The listening session, there was a single sheet of paper with sort of, general platitudes on it, but really not anything too specific. So I'm just going to go through a number of questions and concerns I have that will need to be addressed before I would consider supporting this project. One is I agree with Mr. Dunbar that Sullivan is a navigation center. So I think that to the extent we're all excited to have a navigation center, we already have a navigation center. So how is it different? How is it better? Why is it better to have it there? I think those are questions that need to be answered. Surge capacity, I agree with Mr. Dunbar, if you build something for 330, it will be used for 330. We've seen with Brother Francis that it was used for more than was supposed to be the max. That is what is going to happen. And so we need to be honest about that number with the public. And I don't appreciate that some people don't seem to be honest about what is going to happen. We know, we just seen it happen. Seems to really appear. He knows it's happened. So anyway, just please start talking about the 330 and how it meets our needs, because that's really where we're headed. It's inevitable. I learned the other day in a conversation that this is planned to be a temporary shelter. I think maybe I have been, maybe I just missed that. But to me, the idea to spend over $10 million on a temporary shelter when we could have had something like the Alaska Club, which granted held fewer people, but was permanent for just over $4 million, to me makes absolutely no sense. So I'd like to hear why, if this is temporary, why wouldn't we make an investment to house more people or to provide shelter for more folks? I know we're trying to get to housing. I'm just skeptical that given the challenges that we're going to get there really soon and then no longer need the shelter. I think Mr. Wilson said maybe we could use it for something else. Well, what would we use it for? That's a huge investment, a municipal investment. I mean, that's an investment of dollars that we could spend on any type of service. Why is this building that seems very high cost and temporary the right choice? Another question is this June 30th deadline. I would like to get out of Sullivan. We actually had a plan when I was mayor to get out of the Sullivan by the fall, and that involved purchasing the Tudor and Elmore Alaska Club. The mayor decided not to do that, and so that stalled us. And it took them a while to get on board with this sort of scattered site idea. That stalled us. So about 6 months later now, we're sort of where we are. That's not to undermine the work that everyone's done. I actually really think the facilitated process that Ms. Salatel brought forward has been amazing. It's brought people together. It's made us cohesive. And I really do appreciate that work. But we're sort of delayed here, so to suddenly say, oh, June 30th is our date, and we're going to make fiscal decisions that to me seem really irresponsible. Because we have to meet this artificial date that we said that we could have met before had we actually just come up with a reasonable plan in advance. That feels a little circular to me, and I have a problem with that. So anyway, those are the questions that spring to mind. That obviously doesn't even include the design of the building, how much it's going to cost, what are the details. That's a lot of money, so I want to know more. And given what happened in the past, where we had, at the beginning of the mayor's tenure, he said, oh, it's going to be this much money. Then it doubled. Then it tripled. I mean, really, it's like suddenly it's like $22 million or something. I couldn't even track all the numbers since it was changing so often and always in the up direction. I don't think there's a lot of trust, honestly. At least, certainly for me, there's not a lot of trust that when he says this is the number and this is why, well, we haven't heard why, but this is the number, then it's gonna stay that number. So I need to hear at the work session, and the public needs to hear, this is the number, this is why we need it, this is why it's gonna cost that much, this is why we know it's not gonna go over, et cetera, or else I can't support this. Thank you.
So I'm not gonna ask you to respond, Larry. There's a lot there, and I'm hoping we can find a way to get those questions organized.
Mr. Chairman, I was just gonna ask,
Yeah.
hopefully the clerk is keeping a list of questions for me, and so that, and my shorthand isn't that quick.
Yeah, and we have some
we will,
folks.
there's a lot of questions there that you deserve answers to, and we will do the best to present not only the work session but to the listening session on Monday, and a much more in-depth, detailed report to try to address some of the questions that came out of the first listening session. But we will attempt to address each of those with specificity so that somebody has confidence and information to make a decision, the appropriate decision, whatever that might be.
And those questions on the record were roughly between 11:50 and 11:55. If someone wants to go back in and transcribe them for us, because they exist on the record that will be posted on the website here very soon. But I want to make sure that that's done in an orderly manner. I'm going to change the order briefly and ask Ms. Salatel if she has any final comments before she has to go.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I did provide, and I believe Mr. Rivera was going to send them along, some navigation center materials as to what other communities have done for navigation centers. And I just wanted to make sure we're working from a shared definition of what a navigation center is, because I think my concern is that there's a perception that a navigation center is happening at the Sullivan Arena, and I don't think that's quite an accurate perception. A navigation center is a housing first, low barrier, service enriched environment, and it focuses on moving individuals experiencing homelessness into permanent housing. And that is a really intensive environment, and I would say only in the last 4 weeks, really, where we've harnessed services to do what a navigation center would do. And in fact, we've done so successfully in winding down the Sockeye, when it was a mass care site, the guest house, it closed as a mass care site, and the Alex Hotel. All three of those sites with that navigation center approach, which was a very service-enriched, lots of hours put in, we're able to ensure that none of those individuals who left mass care went into another mass care facility. They all moved into either housing stability program, housing, or a client choice program. That kind of sustained effort is what is really at the heart of a navigation center. And so right now, in a lot of ways, the housing stability program that's been stood up for the month of April at the Alex Hotel, everyone there is already enrolled in that housing stability program. It's no longer part of the mass care system. And what's there is a very intense, service-enriched environment, completely focused on housing. And that's beyond case management. We have case managers, housing navigators, we have people looking for units. We have clients who are engaged at a level that you just don't see right now at the Sullivan Arena. And part of that's capacity. We don't have the capacity with our provider community to support doing that at every existing location we have right now. A lot of it is driven by the closure of operations. We know we have this opportunity at the Alex Hotel until the end of April. So the pressure is on there, and that is where we're concentrating our resources. It doesn't mean we're ignoring the other locations. It's just where we're placing the emphasis and capacity. So make myself available to answer any questions around navigation centers. Have the opportunity to speak on Monday with San Francisco, who has 8 navigation centers in operation, and learn some lessons from them. I'm happy to try to impart that information back to the assembly and the community the best we can. So thanks for the opportunity, and I look forward to further conversation about this.
Meg, before you go, this is probably a question for you or the negotiating team, but for this proposed program, service at the Navigation Center, has it gone through the same internal process to come up with a work plan that shows the public at some point that there's a model here and how it's going to work, what it's going to look like? That probably would go a long ways to helping provide some confidence that the work has been done.
Mr. Chair, for clarification, are you meaning like what occurred at the sockeye?
Yes.
Or for the sockeye?
Yep.
Okay, yeah, that has not been stood up with regards to the tutored Elmore. There is a community of practice that has been stood up around the 3rd Avenue Navigation Center, and there's a lot of overlap there because the Navigation Center, if done correctly, is a navigation center. So the work is started, but we still need to continue to get to the level of the sockeye, where we ended up programmatically.
I see Larry's leaning in.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to address that also, that we had a first meeting, and we're beginning that process to get subject matter experts to contribute to our internal planning. So that, yes, just as we did with the sockeye, we're following that model, and because, as we know, we've never in this community done anything like this, so we need people that have done it to give us best practices, so that in the end result, you have what you want for the facility to deliver the services that the community wants. So, in support of what Dave said, yes, that process has begun. We've had, I believe, one meeting that I was participating in, and there will be subsequent meetings to that until it's finalized, so the best practices will be reflected in the facility.
Okay, so Mr. Dunbar asked you to go back in the queue, but first I want to check with Ms. LaFrance and Mr. Chris Revere, because you've been waiting a long time.
That's fine with me.
Okay. Mr. Chris Revere, is it okay?
I would be happy, actually, Chris, you can take me out of the queue. Ms. Quinn-Davidson and Mr. Dunbar asked all the questions that I was planning on asking, so you can take me out of the queue.
Thank you. So the order now is Mr. Dunbar and Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you. I have specific questions for Ms. Ellison, hopefully she's still online. And it's about the navigation centers, but if someone in the administration can answer, then I'm perfectly happy to have an answer too. So I am really pleased and surprised, frankly, to see that we've been able to shut down all those prior mass care facilities and navigate people away into housing, if that is indeed what occurred. And so I guess I have a couple of questions. One is, how large are each of those respective facilities? So how many beds, how many people did we navigate out of the Alice Hotel and out of the Sockeye in particular? And then second, where were they navigated to? And then third, a question from Rizaldo, hopefully she can hear from San Francisco. I'd like to know sort of how big are the navigation centers and how much do they cost? And then fourth, it's sort of a rhetorical question, but if the goal is to quickly navigate people out of navigation centers into housing, and we've been able to do that successfully because we have the capacity to do it in places like the Sockeye Inn, then why does the facility need to be so large? I mean, if it's basically a pass-through where you have people come in and then quickly send out to housing, then why does it have to be 330 beds? Because if it's a pass-through and you can turn over people quickly, then it seems like it could be much smaller than that, 100 beds or whatever the size of Sockeye was. Because again, people aren't supposed to be there for very long at all. They're being navigated out to housing. So those are my questions.
Mr. Chair, I'm still on, and would be happy to answer Mr. Dunbar's question.
Please.
Okay, so in terms of how many, I will follow up via email with the exact numbers, but I'll do ballparks off the top of my head because I'm getting ready to move in transit. I believe the Sockeye was around 30 individuals. Most of those individuals went into housing, and there were some families there, and those families moved into family housing program with NeighborWorks. The guest house, that was also some families and individuals. I believe we went from about, it's been a lot of numbers lately, so I apologize, and that's why I followed up via email. It was around 25 or so, and it reduced over the course of about 3 weeks, and most everyone went into a housing program. One individual did self-select to move from that guest house program over to downtown Hope Center. But anytime a client chooses to self-select into a program, we want to follow a client choice. And right now, at Alex Hotel, at the beginning of the month, we started with 67 rooms where individuals switched from mass care into a housing stability program. So that meant they had to consent to actively be working toward housing, utilizing housing stability funds available from the municipality through AHFC. And we've had really good success. We've had quite a few individuals move to housing. We have some families again, and we have some veterans. And the veterans are still waiting housing placements, but it looks like the timing may not quite line up, but they'll be on the path to housing. So let me get the firm numbers for you. And what's really changed is catalyzing around the deadline and the resources that are available. And in terms of your request for the information from San Francisco, I can get you that, and then I can send some information. Also, San Diego has one of the longest standing navigation centers, particularly in a tensile structure. I can send some information about that as well. I believe they have a facility that is about 300 individuals, and their budget is online.
Thank you, Ms. Alta. I'll just say on that, I think a 67-bed facility, that was the largest one you described. I think that would be relatively uncontroversial. I think actually the people in the community that are concerned about this would support a 67-bed facility. And it's interesting what you said about, this is catalyzed around deadlines when those hotels are closing. Again, I have to say that we spend $9 million or more building a facility. I don't think that we are going to set a very tight deadline and catalyze in the same way. I just am very skeptical of that concept. But I really agree.
It's 67 units at the Alex. So what we did is we converted 67 units. It wasn't with regard to any navigation centers, external to the municipality. Okay, I just want to make sure I was being clear.
No, I understand. Thank you.
Okay, with that, I have to sign off. I will follow up with the numbers via email. Thank you.
Meg, one last thing. I would just ask that you generate for us a table of the population numbers for the various San Diego, San Francisco navigation centers, so we can understand the scale of each project. Because San Francisco, I know has 8, but I think the biggest one is 100 people. So I just want to make sure we have a clear snapshot. But San Diego is different. It'd be nice to see it. Thank you. So next in the queue is Ms. France.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I also have some questions along the lines of those that have already been stated for preparation for Friday's work session. But first, I really want to express gratitude for your efforts, Mr. Baker and Mr. Weddleton, Mr. Constant, Mr. Rivera, Ms. Zalatel, with the facilitation process. I think that that's a critical process, and as I said before, one in which might be adopted for other complex issues within the municipality. And thank you all so very much for all the hours and presumably blood, sweat, and tears you have poured into it. So my first piece of feedback pertains to information, and I know it's already been touched upon. Some of the feedback that I've heard from the community is that if we don't get the information now and the project moves forward, we might not get the information we need. So there's a real urgency with having those questions, many of which Mr. Dunbar and Ms. Davidson referenced. I think it's also really helpful to have that information in writing. I know that there's information available in terms of like the facilitation updates that's posted on the committee webpage, and I've been referring folks to there for information. But there are a number of concerns, as you know, from the public, wanting clarification about the temporary nature of the shelter. Is it alcohol and drug-free, or is it low barrier? And what other opportunities in the process will the public have to weigh in? And then there are questions too. We received some emails, and I believe the administration has those, but I'll forward as well, just concerning even permitting issues, traffic, those sorts of topics and so on. I would say also the surge capacity is the biggest concern, and I continue, to hear worrying about traffic and pedestrian safety in the area, fire risk in the surrounding woods, and if the surge capacity is implemented and then it's demobilized or unimplemented, what happens to those folks, or what's the trigger? If it goes from 330 to 200, do all the remaining people who don't have another place to go, do they end up camping in the woods? So people definitely want to have discussion about those kinds of scenarios. And I guess my question is, what would it take for the community to support the 130 surge capacity? Because that definitely seems to be the real sticky point in this. I think Mr. Dunbar is right. If it's a smaller capacity shelter or navigation center, there's support for that. I think our community broadly recognizes the need for what you all are doing. And I would just say these meetings are a testimony to the progress. Because I remember when I first got on the body, there was a lot of chaos at the housing and homelessness committee meetings, and over time, I think there's been a real evolution and growth in our ability as a community to have these kinds of difficult conversations, and I think that should be recognized. So again, I would be interested in any kind of point of compromise, or what would it take to assure the community that a 330 surge capacity navigation center could succeed in that area. And maybe it would involve too a mechanism for turning on that surge capacity that would have to come before the assembly, or it would trigger more public process, or it would trigger more resources in the form of traffic calming or public safety. I don't know what that looks like, but that's part of what I would like to hear from folks who live in that community. And then a tangential question is, as we talk about navigation centers, I know there's also a privately funded navigation, Third Avenue. I don't know the status of it, and I understand it's independent from this process, but I'm wondering too, if maybe there could be coordination between the folks who are working on that project and the folks working on this project in terms of handling surge potential, and if there's just any opportunity there. But again, mostly I do want to stress thank you all who've been involved in this process, and I know it's difficult, and I just really appreciate your continued hard work and commitment to tackling these issues, or continuing to tackle these issues. As Ms. Quinn-Davidson pointed out, we've had plans and different efforts and along the way. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Right, that appears to be the last person in the queue on the topic.
Except for me.
Mr. Chairman, if I might, just one detail.
Thank you, Mr. Baker. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, Mr. Wilson, I didn't mean to step on your parade. But to Ms. LaFrance, there's one thing about informing the public. We need to bring the public. That is a really true concern. Just last week, on the municipal homepage, we were getting feedback that, well, where is the information? Well, it's been there under the assembly, in the committee report. It's been there from the facilitation reports, but the public didn't seem to be able to find it. So we made a change, and on the homepage of the municipality now, it's right there. So people can just push the button and get more information, and we'll feed that information there. It's another vehicle. I mean, that's not the all answer, but to help the public get information quickly, that might be a step that help better inform them so they can find them, because we've been calls, where can I find it? Well, you got to go here, and so we try to make it easier. So, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton.
Well, thanks. So there are a lot of questions there that I think we can address on probably on Friday, but I don't want to risk people getting out of here listening to this discussion on the size of the shelter and thinking that it's 330. And because there have been some central compromises. We heard last summer 1,000, and we heard it down to 450, and then worked our way down to 200. This is what's proposed to be designed as a 200-person shelter. It's not 330. So what's proposed is a 200-person shelter, and the way we got to that is looking at how many people were in mass care. That was this facilitated group's mission. And the mass care includes Solon Marina and the number of hotels where people were sheltered, and it was all response to the decreasing capacity of the traditional system and increasing number of people who are homeless related to COVID-19. And we worked backwards. We looked at what can we do, things like the sockeye, various hotels for workforce housing and so on, increases in other capacities such as Solon Marina, Brother Francis. And we worked backwards and we said, well, what's left? 200. And that's what we get the navigation center size, 200, because that's what was left. But we also know that there are times during the year where there are more people. So how many would that be? And we went through the numbers. We said, looking at history, probably about 130 or so. So we said, okay, so the system will need that surge capacity. So any kind of low barrier shelter contemplated should be able to accommodate all or most of that for some moments. So does that mean it's built to 330? No. This is a 200-person shelter that's being proposed. Typically in the design, we would have it designed for 50 square feet per person, including the offices and so on, to do the to build a structure. In an emergency situation, the building code allows 20 square feet per person. So we're not building something at 20 square feet per person. We're building something at 50 square feet per person. But it would allow, in crisis situations, you could tuck them in the aisles and maybe shrink the footprint a little bit of the regular 200 and get them closer to, for the new people, another 20 square feet per person. This is substantially different than saying 50 square feet per person times 330. We're building a 200-person shelter. And I understand that it is part of our job on the Assembly to address earnestly the worst fears of people in these things. But to suggest that a 200-person shelter is crisis and the 150 is not, it simply isn't borne out by the facts. I mean, there are shelters far larger than this that are very successful, don't create blights in neighborhoods. There's no magic number beyond 0. 0 is the magic number that we're striving for. And beyond that, there are very successful shelters of all different sizes, far larger than 200 that's being proposed here. So, we backed into this number by saying, what is the minimum size we will need to be successful in exit to mass care? And I'm afraid in these discussions, we also lose the fact that there are people freezing to death in our woods, in alcoves, in our parks, all in the snow dump and so on, that we have to pay attention to. And if we decide that this shelter is going to be 67, that's not controversial. It is controversial, because that means there will be more people freezing to death and living in our woods and in the alcoves of our businesses and in our yards across the city, and that we know is the big controversy. And creating a controversy over a 200-person shelter when it is simply not a large shelter is not destructive. This is earnestly a 200-person shelter calculated based on the need to get out of mass care. And anyway, but that, so to call it, a 330 or larger, it simply doesn't make sense, and it's not addressing the issue that's before us.
So I myself in the queue briefly, and I would just say that that overflow number is very interesting, because it seems to me a conversation I haven't really seen explored is a way to divide up the possible overflow across multiple locations, a few locations. What comes to mind there is the system that we had before for the overflow that was based on a volunteer organization signing up. And so I'm not suggesting that's a solution here, but it certainly is a conversation where any of the overflow could be shared between location X, Y, and Z, and in that way reduce some of the fears that a location might have that they're going to be the only place. To that, though, Mr. Dunbar's in the queue, and then Mrs. LaFrance had a follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So that was a really interesting point to me that Mr. Wellington about taking the mass care number and working backwards from there. And that happened, of course, we first saw this proposal in the fall, but the circumstances have changed really substantially since the fall. Much to the credit of the Coalition on Homelessness and housing others, we have significantly reduced the number of people that are in mass care. When we just heard that we stood down the Sockeye Inn and the Alice Hotel is in process, and the guest house, and we know the total number has fallen quite a bit too. And so the circumstances have changed, and I think we can rightfully be hopeful that the numbers have changed as well. And then I was going to make the point that I think Chris just made. You know, if we want to surge facilities, we can do it. We don't have to do it all in one place. And in fact, we just heard from Brother Francis Shelter that they're reducing their bed all the way down to 75, which I think is great. I mean, it's better to have smaller facilities. And that facility was built for, I think it was about 120, maybe 150. And then, of course, it was pushed up to 240, which was always unacceptable. But it indicates to me that there probably is surge capacity there. There might be surge capacity in other facilities. And then I'll also remind everyone that in those plans, there was a discussion of not only another housing facility that was going to be there and is going to be somewhere else now, but also the special populations shelter, which we haven't even found a location for. I mean, there hasn't even been a push to find a site for it. And so this is sort of my overall point here is that we are over-concentrating in this one area, pretending like what Mr. Rowe just said, you know, we either build this to 330 or people freeze that. And that's just not the case. That there are other facilities we could create, we are planning to create at least one other facility. And there is capacity at existing facilities to do surges. And as Mr. Thompson pointed out, we always historically use nonprofits and churches to do cold weather sheltering. So I do not agree with the sort of binary that we have to build to 330, especially when the circumstances have fortunately changed when it comes to the number of people who are now in mass care. And so I think you can take that number, you can look at the other facilities, you can build back and land on 150 plus 50 surge capacity, and then absolutely clear if it will not go up to 330, that it will stay, will top out at a 200-bed facility. But again, this is, everybody says, it's not a shelter, this is a navigation center. So people should only be here very quickly and then navigate out to housing. So, using that rhetoric, I think we could go even smaller down to 67, but let's not do that. Let's try 150 plus 50 surge, and I think we will, that will integrate well with the overall system. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
That's very interesting. Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Quick comment and then a follow-up question. And Mr. Constant, you said better than what I was trying to get at with this notion of managing surge across resources when I mentioned the privately funded Third Avenue Navigation Center, that we wouldn't necessarily have to look at the Tudor and Elmore facility as being the only one that would be able to handle any surge. And then my follow-up question is, thank you, Mr. Middleton. I very much appreciate the explanation of how we got to the number, and also the point about the square footage. And the follow-up question I do have is, it would be helpful to me, and I don't know, maybe I'm looking at you, Mr. Baker, to understand how and when that 20 square foot per person emergency situation applies. And maybe I just simply don't remember if it's by assembly resolution or the mayor can just say, we need this and it applies. So this is something that can be answered Friday, and let's get to the answer now. Thanks.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Franz, I think I have the answer, but I'm not positive. Mr. Wimbledon will correct me if I'm in error. I think that the legislative intent and I know that's a generic term, but as Ms. Zalatel is actually the one that put it together, and I think the legislative intent as well, if I recall, was designated for winter. Was that your recollection? I could be wrong, but I think that's what Meg put on the record when she prepared for us. But yeah, I apologize if I'm wrong, but there was some legislative intent around that, and maybe that's something we should discuss further. I think your suggestion is a good one. Maybe there's a trigger mechanism or something that we could collect, and John, maybe we discuss that this afternoon in the facilitation group. I don't know, but I really like that suggestion, and I think that maybe that would give people more confidence that it wasn't a 330, but there was a trigger mechanism for when it was needed. And as I recall, it was restrictive to winter time when the capacity was actually needed. John, could you correct me if I'm wrong on that?
This is my understanding. I think just broadly we were thinking that similar to when the churches were allowed to take people in, there was a temperature, thing. I think that kind of trigger was in there. But Mr. Chair, at some point I'd like to get into you address the error that was.
Go ahead now, we're down to 10 minutes and we still need to
Okay,
get
I think,
final audience participation.
sometimes I'm unclear. Someone, apparently Mr. Dunbar, heard me say that we were building a 330-person shelter, and I want to correct that impression because we're building a 200-person shelter. What happens when we trigger a surge? Well, that's kind of like when your family comes to visit and you've got a 3-bedroom house and there's 5 of you living there comfortably, and now you have 8. You make it work, but you don't want to do it forever, and that's what we're talking about there. The plan is to build a 200-person shelter.
I guess my thoughts on that is come to some neighborhoods in my district and I can show you houses where 16 people are living in with over 5, and they do so in a permanent capacity because it's all that they can afford and it's all that we've made bandwidth for in our housing stock. And so I think that promises are cold comfort to people who have seen how Anchorage implements projects over time. And there was a message that came along long ago when this process started that, well, this is a different administration and going to be done differently. I think the only way it's done differently is when we all get on the same page and agree and follow our agreements. And so that's what this process is getting us toward, I think, Mr. Wellington. So is to where we are in agreement, generally, broadly across the body with the administration. But promises don't mean much when you see how projects have been implemented over time in Anchorage. So with that, I think we're going to move on the agenda. We're going to skip review of goals, legislative priorities in the budget, and we're going to take final audience participation now so we make sure we hear from the folks that have showed up and want to be heard. No objection, we'll do that. Thank you, everybody, for this very interesting conversation. Lays out the landscape of what we're dealing with as we move forward over the next week or so. I see somebody's here. You'll have 3 minutes. Please state your name for the record.
Okay. Did I get ahead of anyone? Before you start the clock, the clock's not showing.
There's no clock I can show you. I'm sorry, we don't have the
Oh,
tools.
that's all right. Did I get ahead of anyone?
You have the floor, Mr.
I have the floor. Thank you. My name is Ron Alego. I consider myself an expert in the unhoused and homeless department, and I don't think anyone knows it better than me. I'm sorry you don't use me as a reference more often and consistently. I sent out an email that I'm here to meet with the committee one-on-one or as a group. 3 things. The sale of my property is still out there. I would like to sell it or lease it. There's been an expert report, as Ms. Quinn-Davidson and Meg mentioned, Agnew Beck, $50,000. It's a location. Had a little visit with the Grim Reaper, so the dirt emperor awaits me, and I want out quicker before that guy gets me. And I would like to move on. So my property is for sale. It's been approved by the community. You should consider a temporary location. There's a big campus there, multiple functioning. But also, as Mr. Constant put on the record, when you bought 2 properties from me, you shorted me $250,000, and you were gonna make it up on the purchase. It's been very difficult through COVID economically. I'm stressed, but you still owe me $250,000. If I could get that money up front, or give it to you give it to me in the form of a lease of my property, the temporary building structure you're talking about, Catholic Charities of Southern Nevada has a great campus, navigation center, housing, and trades. They train them to get jobs, bicycle repair, building small houses, woodlots, etc. So, real quickly, Chris, I don't have a clock in front of me.
You have about 45 seconds.
Okay, real quickly, I'll summarize. Please entertain the idea of purchasing my property. I want out. I'm a little desperate medically. It's been very stressful on my family, my wife, my spirituality, and I've completed anger management, listening to all you're spending money and watching it. I think you're navigating the ship is called the Flying Dutchman, and you're all aboard. But I would like to be paid off, purchase my property. We're accustomed to homeless in that area, and the safeguards you're projecting or proposing to these other neighborhoods, you're like taking a diseased pine tree and spreading it around the city.
That's your time.
So, in summary, buy my property. I need the $250,000 you shorted me. If you
That's your
can
time.
cover that.
We have someone else to speak behind you.
Okay, I'd be more than happy to answer any questions. As I stated, I'm an expert.
3.5 minutes now, Ron.
Pardon me?
3.5 minutes. It's time to
Is it
finish.
over?
Yeah.
But I'm going to join Mr. Hagerman. Could you put my name on that plaque on the podium, because I don't see it here.
It's not there yet.
Thank you, Chris.
So we have enough time for one more person, Ron. And I'm not putting your name on the plaque till you go.
Okay, as my dog would say, we'll smell you all later.
Next, member of the public, come on up. 3 minutes, please say your name, like part-time living.
Roger Branson, Eagle River, long-time mental health advocate, and I just want to bring remembrance how long these last 2 or 3 years have been, the great work we've made in this time, and the good ongoing work that is being facilitated only because we're all keeping our eyes on the prize, which is the human beings, the lives that we serve. And so, it's been a long few years as we go through these final phases, just user friendliness, user outcomes. Let's keep a focus on the people who are coming out of the system, what they say didn't work. I think we're on track to really do a lot of good for the city and maybe set up a model that others can follow. So thanks all.
Thank you. And since he spoke short, we do have time for one last one. Please come on, state your name for the record and what part-time living.
Thank you. Sure, I'll try to keep it quick. My name's Daniela Delosier. I live in East Anchorage. I'm a 1.5 miles from the proposed Cedar Elmore location. And I guess I just want to really say that I think that this plan to build another mass care center anywhere in the city, not just on East Anchorage, is just a really terrible idea for Anchorage. I think it's really not exiting mass care. You're just moving mass care to someone else's neighborhood. We have neighbors who actually just moved to our neighborhood who lived in Sullivan area and moved to get away from it, and I feel terrible for them because they're about to enter the same hell that they lived in before. So I just really want to point out that 200 people is a lot, just like the CEO from Catholic Social Services just said in this meeting. 200 people. I forget what she worded. 200 people is a massive amount of people to have. And it's not trauma-informed care. You guys are building this shelter for yourselves. The mayor's building it for himself. To put a gold star on his chest to say, I solved homelessness. And I went to the very first listening session earlier last year when he very first became elected. And he was very open and honest about his intent to use law enforcement to abate camps. As soon as he met the threshold for housing, which is where he references the Boise decision. And I think that is still very clearly his intent, is to meet this threshold as quickly as possible with a 200-bed shelter so that he can begin using law enforcement, not trauma-informed approach to helping the unhoused. So I just want to say, I really think the Assembly should not give any more money to this project. What my biggest hope is to see you guys do this work, is to bring on more smaller shelters. Please don't build a 200-person shelter anywhere in this town, not just in my neighborhood, no one else's neighborhood. So I'd really like to see more work to bring more smaller, under 100 people, like they mentioned, 67, 75 shelters that are in existence. We have a lot of dilapidated buildings in Anchorage. Let's fix those up. That really says a lot about our built environment that our kids see, about these rundown buildings that no one's using. I'd like to see those fixed up and used to help people, because that's what I'd like to show my kids. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else? Hearing seen none, that section of our agenda is concluded. Now, any last comments from the members? I will only add one thing, that the lady from CSS was a little more nuanced in what she said. That she said that 200 people is a lot for a building that was designed that way. And so that building was not designed for that volume of people. Design is a very important part of the conversation. But I don't disagree with anything else you said. So, thank you, everybody. Hearing no comments from the members of this committee is adjourned. Before I adjourn, actually, I want to say I'm sorry to the Coalition of Homelessness who had a report to give, but because we went into the next item, we missed their report, and they'll speak with Mr. Rivera and get on the agenda again. Now we're adjourned.